Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Amen. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Let's start with a prayer. God, we love you so much for how you take care of us, how you love us. And as we look at the words of your Son, it's a daunting task to really consider them. They have a lot to say. And just pray that we can get what we need to out of it today. Help me to communicate what you want me to communicate today. And just thank you so much for the joy it is to be together as a family and to sit at the feet of your Son and learn. We love you. Amen. It's great to see everybody. Usually I greet you at the start, but I wanted you to have the experience that people who were there had, at least to some degree, of sitting down to listen to Jesus and these being the first words that you heard. And it probably didn't take very long for them to figure out that this was something entirely different when they heard those words. The Sermon on the Mount is it's an overwhelming task to talk about because it's so important. I told somebody this morning I feel like the more I prepared for this sermon, the less prepared I felt. But that's okay; it'll be fine. But God has a lot of things to tell us in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Beatitudes especially. If you wonder where the word beatitude came from, it sounds like the Latin for what was described as happiness. So we'll talk about that along the way. But we're going to dig into the Beatitudes today. What I read is really what we're talking about. We'll go to a few other passages as we illustrate things. But these verses that we read at the outset are our topic for today. So the Sermon on the Mount. If you wonder, we've got a dramatic characterization. I love this slide that Jared prepared. Jesus on top of that mountain. But this is where it was thought to have actually happened. We don't know for certain. But this is the area where it took place, and this is what it looks like. So it's quite a sight in the mountains there, but that's what the area looked like. So let's talk about our discussion of the Beatitudes today. The first thing, we're going to talk about a few things before we dive into the text. That little icon is supposed to be a mountain, but it doesn't look like it very much. It looks kind of like a lava cake at a restaurant. But before we dive in, we're going to look at some things just to get us in the right frame for what we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about this. I'll take half, please. That'll make sense when we get to it. And then lastly, we're going to go through the Beatitudes one by one and talk about them. And we won't exhaust the topic, but we'll talk about each one individually and what they have to say to us. So let's get after it. Before we dive in, just a few background things here. Number one is the audience that Jesus spoke to. I want to look at verse 1 of chapter 5, which I didn't read, because this is kind of interesting, or at least it was to me. Verse 1, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. You know, I think that a lot of times when we think about the Sermon on the Mount, we think of the Sermon on the Mount as a sermon to this massive crowd that was evangelistic in nature. And yet that's really not what the text tells us. We might read that and say, well, why did he sit down? Well, in the Jewish culture, that was the normal teaching position for a rabbi. He sat, and his disciples sat around him and learned. at his feet. And so Jesus goes up on the mountainside and sits down, and the crowd doesn't come to him, it's his disciples. Now, look, I don't know how many there were. It could have been a sizable group, but it wasn't the huge crowd that was there at the beginning. It was people who had already made a decision to follow him. It was his followers. Now, the message was certainly meant for the masses, but that was going to come by way of his disciples who would pass on what he taught them. And so it's perhaps a little bit closer and more intimate setting than we typically think about or we see depicted in movies and stuff. But he taught his disciples as they sat by him as he sat there teaching them. So that's the audience that he taught. Oh, well, see, I could have clicked that and then I could have read it with you. So that's the audience. Second, the word blessed. Well, this is an interesting, you might have been surprised when I read the text that I didn't say blessed. This word is, this sermon's so special we don't even talk normally when we read it. We say blessed instead of blessed. I mean, if you say nobody says God really blessed me. That's not how we read the word. But in the Beatitudes, we say blessed. I don't know how that got started, but it did. But what does this idea of blessed mean? Because it's a word we read, but maybe we're not familiar with it. Well, it means to be divinely or supremely favored. A lot of theologians attach the word fortunate to it. I'm fortunate. It's to be blissfully happy or contented. Oh, I like this sermon already. I'll take 2 of those, please. It's to be happy. Not just happy, blissfully happy. Content. Or enjoying the bliss of heaven. There's a lot of ideas you read about if you look up in dictionaries. But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this idea of blessed. So what is Jesus trying to tell us? He's trying to tell us how to be these things. Are you guys interested in having that in your life? Is that something you want? All right, I figured it was. Third thing, one of the things that's remarkable about the Beatitudes is there's almost nothing spoken about in the Beatitudes about behavior, if you notice. Jesus addresses who we are, not what we do. So that's something that we'll talk about along the way. We'll talk about that now. Look over Mark chapter 7.
Come on, Randy. I'm ready.
Mark chapter 7, and we're not going to read this whole passage, but it's worth a read later. In verse 1 of Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees get upset with Jesus and his disciples because they aren't washing their hands. Verse 1, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating, and with food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremony. It goes on to tell you the details. So verse 5, so the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their foods with defiled hands? He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Jesus didn't hold back much. He says, that doesn't matter. It wasn't actually a law. It was something that they had made up. But he takes them to task because they're focused in on this behavioral thing instead of what really matters. So Jesus looks at the heart, not at behavior rules. Now, here's a question. Does that mean behavior doesn't matter? Does that mean behavior is unimportant? I just got to get my heart right and what I do doesn't matter. That's certainly not what the scriptures teach. In fact, in this same interaction, if you look down at verse a little farther down in verse 20, Jesus is talking to his disciples later. He went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them, for from within, out of a person's hearts, Out of a person's heart come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. So these things are behavioral in nature, but they're important because they come from the heart. Behavior reflects the heart, and so it matters. But God is primarily focused on the heart, and that's what the Beatitudes talk about. Last thing, the Beatitudes are counterintuitive. I put in parentheses there, they're unworldly. By unworldly, I mean they're not the way the world thinks. You know, Beatitudes don't make sense to the world. People read the Beatitudes and say, I can't relate to that. Let me ask you a question. Is the world blissfully happy and contented? Is that the way it is in your neighborhood? The world is a mess. It just is. I mean, we live in strange times. We live in times where we have more ways of being connected than ever before. And yet, how many people have the kind of friendship and relationship that John and Byron talked about today? Not very many. We have all kinds of dating websites and ways that people can meet, and yet people are lonely. We have more ways to get help and tools to deal with mental health issues and mental illness, and yet depression is an epidemic. We're not solving the underlying problems, and all of these things can be helpful. I'm not saying they're all bad. The point is, the world isn't all that happy and contented. So I have a question for you. Why do we tend to follow them and try to fit in if it's not working for them? Here's the thing. If we use worldly principles and methods, we'll get the same result that the world gets. If we want different results, we have to think differently. And that's what Jesus is trying to give us in the Beatitudes. He's helping us know how to think. All right, so let's get into it. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of I'll take half, please. I've been studying this for a long time, and I can't remember now where things come from. But we talked about this in our community group before this came up, and one of the things we had a good laugh about was the fact that we only want part of what's in the Beatitudes. I'll illustrate the point. I want the kingdom of heaven. You want that too, right? But I'm not so sure about this poor in spirit thing. Okay? I'm not sure about that. I want to be comforted. And do we like comfort? We like our comfort, don't we? I mean, you got your special chair. We like comfort. But I don't want to mourn. We want to be filled with righteousness, or at least if we don't get too carried away with that. I mean, we want to be filled with righteousness, right? But I don't like hunger and thirst. That's less attractive. I want to inherit the earth. I don't know if I want the whole thing, but I'll sell off the parts I don't want. I mean, that sounds like a good financial gain there to inherit the whole earth. But this meekness thing, no, I'm not sure I like that. I want to receive mercy. Does anything feel as good as receiving mercy when you need it? But I'm not sure I want to be merciful. Oh, look at that. I got ahead. Because being merciful means something has happened to me, or I'm out of pocket, or in some way something's impinging on me if I have to be merciful. I want to see God. Well, maybe this one's okay. Okay, pure in heart is good, but then you start thinking about purification. We'll talk about that later. I'm not so sure how that works, so I'm not sure what I think about that. I want to be called a son of God, but this acting as a peacemaker thing sounds messy to me. If you don't believe it, just try to be a mediator sometime. It's messy. I want the kingdom of heaven still. I wanted that at the beginning. But does anybody really want to be persecuted? Probably not. I mean, we might say, yes, we do because we know that's the right answer, but we really don't want that. So, we want half of the Beatitudes, but it's a package deal. That's the problem. So let's talk about the Beatitudes one by one. First one. Well, shucks, that's supposed to be blue. It doesn't really look blue. That's all right. It's blue. You can see it? Okay. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What's it mean to be poor in spirit? What does it mean to be poor in spirit? Well, the idea of being humble or contrite, which means small, that's in there. We can relate to that. That's connected to the idea. That's going to come up more later in one of the other Beatitudes. But it's to be humble, to be contrite. It's to be needy. All right, now we're getting into a situation where we don't want to be. How many of you like the feeling of being needy? Do you want to be needy? Do you want to have to ask for help? I don't think any of us like that. How do we like to feel spiritually? Do we want to feel spiritually needy? Sadly, we don't a lot of times. And yet, we're talking about us and God. We're always needy, whether we recognize it or not. And so Jesus says, look, to be poor in spirit, to recognize that you're needy is important spiritually. That's when you get the kingdom of heaven. There's a couple of great examples that will help us understand this idea. In Luke chapter 8, I'm just going to allude to these. You can read them later. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells us a story of a Pharisee and a tax collector who are praying. And the tax collector is humble. He says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But the Pharisee's prayer is, God, I am so glad that I'm the guy that well, let's go ahead and read it. His prayer is so good, we got to read it. It's always a bad idea to take the preacher's word for it. You ought to read it yourself. Okay, Luke chapter 18, verse 9. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. Boy, we look at that guy and we say, I don't like that guy. It's easy to drift into that lane. It's easy to be needy spiritually when you first start out, isn't it? I mean, you're baptized, you come out, you don't know anything. You just know that, you found something great and people teach you stuff and that's great. But after a few years, we start to get more like this guy. We start to feel like we only needed a little bit of grace. We got to get ourselves together. We're cleaned up pretty good. And it's easy to start looking down on other people. Jesus says you got to be poor in spirit if you want the kingdom of heaven. You've got to stay needy spiritually. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, there's a verse that in the middle of the conversation with the church at Laodicea. This is audience participation time. What was the big problem with the church at Laodicea? Lukewarmness, right? Everybody knows. Yeah, they were lukewarm. Wrong. That's not the problem. That's how the problem manifested itself. But the problem in verse 17 was that they didn't think they had needs. Jesus says, you say, I am rich and I have acquired wealth and I am not in need of anything. And so it showed up as lukewarmness. Easy for us to get in that spot, isn't it? It's not really wrong. I mean, they were lukewarm. But, that was for effect. Beatitude number 2. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What do we associate mourning with? Death. That's what we associate it with in our culture. It wasn't that way in their world. Mourning was a different kind of thing for them. It was more than just mourning a death. We see examples of this. If you read the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, you see Nehemiah mourning over what was going on in Jerusalem. I mean, he fasted for days. He was torn up over it. He mourned. If you read Daniel chapter 10, he receives a vision, and it's a terrifying vision, and he goes into mourning. Look over in Matthew chapter 9. I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 23. I should read my own slide. Matthew chapter 23, verse 37. We see Jesus doing this here. In verse 37, Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate." Jesus is mourning over the state of Jerusalem because of where they're at spiritually. You know, that's something that we see throughout the Bible that's foreign to us, and yet when the Beatitude is talking about mourning, that's wrapped up in it. We also see Paul talk about this in 2 Corinthians 11:28. He talks about how he feels the pressure for all the churches. Do we mourn about what we see in the world that's not right? Do we mourn about where the church is at sometimes? That's foreign to us. We complain about the church. We might complain about brother so-and-so or sister such and such, but, do we mourn about what's going on and really make a difference in people's lives because of that? Jesus says that's when we will receive comfort, is from that mourning. Next beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Okay, this is really a word we don't use very often except when we read the Bible, the idea of meek. Or if we do, we don't consider it a positive usually. But meekness is not weakness. It's a strong characteristic. Some of the greatest people in the Bible were considered the champions of meekness. Moses, Jesus, they were meek in their nature. And so it's not weakness, but it's humble before God and people. It's being calm to endure hardship or an offense. And you're only going to get there with God. This humility thing is something that we all say, that's a good thing, right? But we don't want to go through the stuff we need to go through to get it. I'll give you an illustration. This happened to me this week. So Corbin and Val and Flo come over every other Monday to our house. And so you saw in another sermon I did, we have toys for Flo. I didn't do a picture this time. But we wanted to sit out on the patio. So we thought, well, I know what we'll do. My wife, being thoughtful, buys one of these little Tykes basketball hoops, right? The ones you can adjust up and down. So we have it on the very lowest setting, and, it comes with 3 basketballs, and we're sitting in the 4 chairs out there on the patio. And so Flo loves it. She's having fun playing with it. And so she brings the ball to Corbin, and he shoots, and nothing but net, right through. Then she brings one to Betsy. Betsy shoots, makes the basket. Brings one to Val. Val shoots, makes the basket. They shoot a few more, they make them. Then she brings one to me. Now I'm thinking to myself, I am a basketball guy. All my life, played basketball. And I had a good shot. I couldn't jump, but I had a shot. So I said, I'm gonna make this work. Watch this, Flo. And I shoot, clank, off the rim. She goes and gets it, brings it back to me. I shoot again. Miss, 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 miss. I shot 12 times in a row and missed. And I'm thinking, I'm going to dominate this thing. I can't get it in the basket to save my life. Now, I will say in my defense that I was in the farthest away chair from the basket, okay? And I was kind of sideways. And finally, I made one, and then I made another. I made 7, 8 No, Corbin said I only made 5. Look, that's a simple example. But we don't like humility when it's happening to us. But it's valuable. Meekness is of great worth. He says you're going to inherit the earth. What does that mean? What does it mean that you're going to inherit the earth? Does that mean somebody's going to get Ukraine and Russia and we're going to get that straightened out over there? I don't think that's what it means. He's talking in an eternal perspective. Read Revelation 21, 1 through 4, about the new heaven and the new earth. This is a long-term game from God's perspective. We're going to inherit the earth that matters, but we got to be meek if we want to do that. Next beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. When we think about righteousness, we think about our behavior. That's what we tend to think about. I don't smoke and get drunk and carry on and carouse anymore now that I'm a disciple. I don't do those things. That's good. And if you're still having issues with those, you got to quit. But that's not all that's being talked about in this beatitude. In the Jewish way of thinking, the way they thought about righteousness, and you read this all through the scriptures, it's doing the right thing. And it's bigger than just the individual. It's in society. It's in the way that we treat people. That's all. It's very strongly connected to God's justice. That's why you'll see when God's talking to people in the Old Testament and he's telling them he's upset with them, a lot of times what he brings up is that they're not taking care of widows and orphans and they're exploiting people and they're shedding innocent blood. Those things are offensive to God, and they're not right. And so when God talks about righteousness, it's a bigger picture. Now, our personal righteousness is a subset of that. Doing the right thing includes how we behave, but that's not the whole story. So it's a bigger picture. When we talked about all that, we've got to stay hungry and thirsty. This isn't a kind of thing where we get hungry and thirsty once and we eat and we're done and we don't have to be hungry and thirsty anymore. Anybody here ever figure out how to eat one meal and be satisfied for the rest of your life? No, I don't think so. That doesn't last. It lasts a few hours and then you're ready to go again, right? It's got to be that way with righteousness. I don't think we have a problem with being hungry and thirsty for righteousness for a minute, but the idea that you're going to be a disciple for 20, 30, 40 years and you're still going to have to be that way, that can be demanding. We've got to stay hungry and thirsty for righteousness if we're going to be filled. Amen. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. All right, this one's a two-parter. There's two primary uses for this idea of mercy that we see in the scriptures, and both of them are challenging, to be honest. The first one is the idea of forgiveness. We've got to forgive. There are very few things in the Bible where God says, if you don't do that, I won't forgive you. That's a short list. God says, if you don't forgive others, I won't forgive you. Matthew 18, chapter 21 through 35, there's a great story about an unmerciful servant. We don't have time to read it. But God, the master who's representing God in the story, forgives an enormous debt to one of his servants, a debt that he has no hope of repaying. And then that servant goes out and he won't forgive a small debt to his fellow person. He starts choking him and putting him in prison. And when the master hears about it, he actually unforgives him. That's a scary concept. But Jesus at the end of that story says, that's how it is with you. If you don't forgive people, God's not going to forgive you. That's something to take note of. Here's the thing. In a room this size, I don't have anybody in mind, okay? So nobody's told me your secrets. So if you're thinking, who talked to that guy? Nobody did. In a room of this size, there's somebody or multiple somebodies in this room that are having trouble forgiving someone. Don't let that stay with you. Don't let that stay with you. You got to forgive people if you want to be forgiven by God. The other way this is used is just in the sense of compassion. You know, when Bartimaeus calls out in Mark chapter 10 to Jesus asking for his sight to be restored, he says, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He's not asking for forgiveness, although I think he receives it ultimately. That's not what he's asking for. He's asking for mercy. He's asking for pity. He's asking for compassion. He's asking for healing. And so we've got to be compassionate. I would like to just talk about forgiveness on this point because I'm pretty good at forgiveness. I don't have a lot of problem with that. I don't run around feeling like I have something against this person and that person and the other person. I'm not that good at compassion. I've got to get better at that. I mean, I have my good days and my bad days, but I'm not as compassionate as I need to be. If I want to receive mercy, I've got to dole it out in the same way that I want to receive it. So that's what this is talking about. Thankfully, God is merciful, and he's encouraging all of us to imitate him in that way. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Boy, we want to see God, right? The process of purification isn't necessarily easy, is it? Hebrews 12:11 talks about how no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. But later it produces good. We want to be pure. We want to have the right heart, but that purification process is a little daunting sometimes, isn't it? I mean, how do you purify gold? You heat it up and burn off the bad stuff. Anybody ever feel like they're going through the fire in life? We feel that way sometimes, don't we? We're being purified. Holiness is an inside-out proposition. We looked at that in Mark 7 earlier, and God continues to refine us. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. I thought about first responders. You know, first responders, we admire them because they go into situations that everybody else is running away from. There was a house on fire in our neighborhood last night. Everybody else was staying away. The firemen were there putting it out, taking care of it. It looked like everything was okay this morning as we were leaving. We don't know the circumstances. But, you know, that's what they do, and we look up to them for that. How are we when we see trouble, when there's conflict, either with us and somebody else, or maybe people that aren't even involved with us? Do we run away? Do we mind our own business, or do we help conflict to get resolved? That's a demanding thing, and it's hard to do, but it's valuable. And God says if you do that, you'll be called a son of God. Our whole ministry is a ministry not of just converting people to our church. It's a ministry of reconciliation. It's resolving a conflict, helping people make peace with God. That's what we do. And so we need to be peacemakers, but that's demanding. The last one is so long I can't put the stuff under it. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. This is our last one. You know, why does Jesus say this? Why be persecuted? Well, you know, he talks about this idea in John chapter 3, and he talks about it in terms of truth and light. He says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men preferred darkness because their deeds were evil. People don't necessarily like the light. People don't react well to truth. We don't need to seek out persecution. That's not what Jesus is telling us to do. It'll find you if you tell the truth. Here's the interesting thing. Jesus received his primary opposition from religious people. false religion doesn't like the truth. Read 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 sometime. He says people are going to surround themselves with people who tell them what their itching ears want to hear. Is there ever a more apt description of modern religion than that?
Come on.
Look, here, I'm not looking to pick a fight with anybody. But what the Bible says, if you compare this chapter, what's said here with the verses in Luke that are parallel to this, Jesus says, woe to you if everybody speaks well of you. If everybody thinks you're great, you're on the wrong track. We get this backwards. We think if somebody's criticizing us, if somebody has problems with us, we must be doing something wrong. And if everything's going well with everybody and everybody likes us, we're doing the right thing. Jesus says, no, it's exactly the opposite. We don't need to be nasty. We don't need to be confrontational in our nature. That's not the point. But if we tell the truth, some people aren't going to like it. We can't back off of that. Jesus didn't. Look, Jesus was the most loving person that ever lived, and they killed him. We shouldn't be surprised if people don't like the truth in our time. Those are the Beatitudes. There's a lot to think about in them. We've scratched just the surface today. I hope you'll take some time to really drink it in and think about it, because it's worthy of it. But the real question at the end of it all is, how do I think? Is this the way that I believe and act, and is this how I'm living my life? Remember, what does Jesus want? What's the point of all these Beatitudes? What are we trying to get to? Heaven. But he wants us to be blissfully happy. And we all said we wanted that. This is the path to get there, God's way. Hope this has been helpful to you. Thanks so much. Have a great week.